Welcome to the France 24 debate. I'm Mark Owen. Indonesia's parliament has approved legislation that will outlaw sex outside marriage. Critics are already calling this a huge setback to rights. It was endorsed by all 9 political parties in a sweeping overhaul of Indonesia's criminal code. Rights groups are protesting against the amendments, denouncing them as a crackdown on civil liberties and political freedom, as well as a shift towards fundamentalism. Indonesia is the world's most populous Muslim country, but the constitution recognises 5 religions alongside Islam. There are questions raised in many sectors, including the tourism sector, in particular Bali, the paradise resort that is a mecca for fun lovers seeking sun, sand and good times. Many Australians, it's well known, head to Bali, but there's an international sound to the resort all year round. Could that change as a result of this new penal code? So to sum it up, no sex outside marriage, no promotion of contraception, so therefore the notion of safe sex goes out the window, no defamation of the president. That's an interesting change, isn't it? All this coming after a rise in religious conservatism in the country. Our panel to discuss the issues that this raises both in Indonesia and beyond. Here in the studio, David Cambrew, Honorary Senior Research Fellow and Adjunct Professor at Sciences Po CRE Paris. Thank you, sir, very much for being with us, David.
My
Great
pleasure.
to see you. Join us by Skype from Bielefeld in Germany. Antje Misbach, Professor of Sociology at Bielefeld University. Anja, great to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
By Skype from Washington, Mustafa Akyol, Senior Fellow on Islam and Modernity at the Cato Institute, author of Reopening Muslim Minds, Why, as a Muslim, I Defend Liberty, the Islamic Jesus and Islam Without Extremes. Thank you, sir, for being with us. I'll let you speak in a moment. First, Nicholas Rushworth here at France 24 takes a look at the story.
The new criminal code was backed by all of Indonesia's political parties. It ushers in a series of controversial changes, not least a ban on sex outside marriage, punishable by up to a year in prison. And it prohibits the cohabitation of unmarried couples. The country's Law and Human Rights Minister justified the measures.
We hope that after the long debate, people will understand that we have done everything to take their aspirations into account as much as possible. We have debated all the important issues where our opinions differed.
MPs said they wanted to put an end to the current penal code, which dates back to the Dutch colonial era prior to the country's independence in 1949. Indonesia is the most populous Muslim country in the world. It has long been praised for its religious tolerance. Secularism is enshrined in the constitution. The new code will come into force in 3 years' time and will apply to foreign travellers. The Jakarta Post said it had grave concerns about how certain measures could be implemented. The code will include a ban on insulting the president. Protesters gathered outside the parliament to express their dismay. They condemn a crackdown on civil liberties and a shift towards fundamentalism.
So dismay being expressed by those demonstrators. There were more, of course, than the 3 that we saw in the final shot there. Let's bring in Mustafa Akyol, who's joining us from Washington, Senior Fellow on Islam and Modernity. Mustafa, thanks for being with us. I'm just interested to hear what you've got to say about the changes that Indonesia is now imposing.
Thank you for having me. Indonesia is, of course, actually a country with moderate tradition of Islam, with actually some progressive views coming out in the past couple of years. But these are concerning, and 2 things are concerning here. One is the introduction of what I would call morality police, as we see in Iran, which is leading to human rights violations and a lot of chaos and oppression in society. The other one is some kind of political authoritarianism, because the criminalization of insulting the president and even government ministries is, of course, concerning, and it can be used to silence critics. Going back to the issue of morality, I mean, the issue of marriage outside of sex has been mentioned. I mean, Islam is a conservative religion by measures, and like many conservative Christians or Jews, Muslims are, devoted to family values, and that's totally fine. So a lot of Muslims do not engage, sex outside of marriage, and that's totally fine and that's respectful. The question is, do they want to impose this by law on other people in modern states, where you have actually different people with different, religious views, different people with more secular views of life. And therefore, as someone who values the Islamic tradition and Islamic values of family as well, I believe Muslims should just abide by these values themselves without trying to impose them by law, which is, I think, happening in this case in Indonesia, and that's why it's wrong.
So your perspective, Mustafa, if I'm hearing this correctly, is that you would want people personally to live by those kind of ideals, but that should be their personal choice and their personal domain, and it shouldn't be something that's imposed on everybody else by the state.
Exactly, that's the point. I mean, for example, most Muslims don't drink alcohol, and because Islam considers it as haram, it's a sin. That's totally fine, and Muslims should live by that. But they should not punish people for drinking alcohol by law. Why that is the case? Because if you start doing that, there's no end to this dictate, right? Muslims sometimes find themselves as minorities where their values are banned by law. It's happening in India, for example. So I think in a modern world where we have modern states, the law of that state should not be defined by the perspectives of one religion, even the sect of that religion, but by general human rights principles that most people could agree on and live by. And that requires for some change in Islamic thinking, obviously, because in the classical Islamic view, the state and religion were very much combined. But I think we need a shift forward. I call it the John Locke moment in Islam, where the idea of freedom and a neutral government has to be accepted by Muslims. And a lot of Muslims actually do accept it, either by intuition or there are scholars with some modernist, progressive, reformist views, and I work on that field. And I think this is a bad news in Indonesia, but I'm sure in Indonesia there are also some more progressive Muslims, liberal Muslims, despite their faith in the tradition of Islam, do find this as a wrong step. And similar steps like this, let alone in totally oppressive ones in Iran and elsewhere, in Afghanistan too.
Indeed, we are seeing the demonstrations as you were speaking to Mustafa. Bear with us for now, please, Mustafa Akyol. Let's go to Bielefeld in Germany. Antje Misbach, waiting for us there, Professor of Sociology at Bielefeld University. Antje, thanks so much for being with us here in France 24. We appreciate your time. We've heard there from Mustafa Akyol about this idea of this could be something that people live by, but it shouldn't be imposed by the state. The fact that Indonesia is making a law about these things clearly takes that a lot further than many people feel comfortable with. Also, the other aspect, of course, you can't criticize the president. Where does it stop is the question some people might be asking.
Where does it stop? But also, where does it start? The new penal code opens up a lot of doors for people abusing the law by pushing down all sorts of people who are peacefully using their right to critique things that are not going well in Indonesia. And they could be then blamed for defamation vis-a-vis either the president or state institutions, because it doesn't stop with defamation of the president, but anybody who says something negative about state institutions could possibly be facing allegations of defamation. And that is a very worrying aspect. Some Indonesian critics have talked about this and said that this is in fact a huge step back for Indonesian democracy.
Antje, thank you for now. I'll pause you there. At that point. Thank you very much indeed. I hope you can still hear us and bear with us. I'll come back to you as soon as I possibly can. Come to the studio now. David Cameron is with us. David, you have a great knowledge of the Indochina area, Southeast Asia, and we called upon you to talk about many countries there. How do you feel about what you're hearing about Indonesia today, about this development? How does it make you feel?
It's part of a trend. We've seen an increasing kind of conservatism in Indonesia. I think it was symbolized most recently in the elections of 2019 when President Widodo Jokowi chose as his running mate, rather than somebody from outside Java, he chose another Javanese, which is the first time this has occurred since Indonesia's independence. He chose as his running mate Maruf Amin, who was chairman of the Ulama Council of Indonesia. And President Widodo, who's a very, very clever politician, is involved in something that Tony Blair knows called triangulation. He's trying, at the one hand, to exclude Islamic radicals, so that, for example, the Islamic Front Pembala Islam has been declared illegal. So he's tried to exclude the real hardliners, political Islam, but at the same time to pander to the conservative side of Islam in Indonesia, and that's expressed in his coalition government. Indonesians themselves, strangely, for the world's largest Muslim country, do not vote up till now for, in a majority way, for Islamic parties. About a quarter of the seats are parties which declare themselves as Islamic. But we've seen a growing conservatism amongst young people. We now have a movement where young people are getting married very young in order precisely to avoid, sex outside of marriage. My view is that, sex should be in the bedroom where it belongs and not in the Houses of Parliament, to use that old joke. So it is representative of this development. And it is also calling into question our views of, moderate Islam, what we call civil Islam in Indonesia. Indonesia has the world's two enormous Islamic organizations, one called Muhammadiyah, which has 30 to 35 million members, and another Ulama, which has something between 40 and 50 million members. And the second group, in fact, produced a president of Indonesia. Indonesia is the world's largest Muslim country, but Islam is not the official religion. And as you said, under the principle of Pancasila, the five precepts, five religions are accepted. There is this idea of belief in one God, but other religions, Christianity, Protestantism, Catholicism, even Confucianism, are accepted. So it is really a step backward, and it's very different to the Indonesia we knew. I mean, the first president of Indonesia, Sukarno, was a notorious womanizer. He was serially monogamous. I think he had 7 or 8 wives, and he once said that a beautiful woman is a gift of God. If one doesn't sort of attempt to benefit from her, then this is an insult to God. Now, we're far from that. The problem is
a huge change, isn't it? A huge change in...
Certainly, and certainly this idea that these matters which are of personal morality are now to be legislated on is a change. However, there are parts of Indonesia, for example, in Aceh, where Sharia law is imposed, and there are different regions at the local level where Sharia law is imposed. So there is already the morality police are already there, so to speak, in parts of Indonesia. The problem is going to be first of all, it's a problem of ethnicity for ethnic minorities who represent 5 to 10% of the population. Not just Christians, but Animus, people in Papua, in West Irian, rather. So that is problematic. And there's also a serious economic issue here. I mean, in most Western countries today, the first child is born to people out of wedlock. Marriage is now sort of a minority choice in most Western countries. And these people go to Indonesia from Australia, but also from Europe, for holidays. So, if they try to check into a hotel room, are they going to be, is the police going to be called? Are they going to be punished? When there was the first attempt to introduce these laws in 2019, there were 2 groups involved protesting. First group were students, and this is a tradition in Indonesia. But the second was the people of Bali, in the tourism industry. Now, Bali is Hindu. It has a different view of sexuality than that in Islam. But there was also an economic consideration because, tourism is the major source of revenue for Bali, for other parts of Indonesia as well.
David, thank you very much indeed. I'm fascinated by the first president, the way you've described his lifestyle compared to what is now being imposed by the current president. It is a massive swing in terms of change there. And this point about Bali and tourism being possibly under threat, I think is quite interesting. Mustafa, can I bring you back in on that one to talk about the issue that might be raised by what happens in Bali? It's a tourist destination. It is a beautiful place to be. 250,000 visitors in July alone this year, which says that this is big business for Indonesia. And I'm wondering whether that could be put under threat by this new change.
Well, no, I don't know the specifics of Bali and how necessarily it's influenced by this. I've been there once. I know, yeah, it's a touristic destination. But that aspect, like tourists will come to this country to visit for just a few weeks, and they're not expected to live by Islamic standards in the first place. So why are you imposing on them a law that is inspired by your Islamic values? So that is the question that must be brought up to Indonesians or others who want to impose a certain Islamic way of life through the nation state. Now, there's one thing I think conservative Muslims need to see, that in pre-modern Islamic times, let's say the Ottoman Empire, there was Islamic law that was applicable to Muslims only. So in the Ottoman Empire, Muslims were expected not to drink alcohol, and it was banned by the government. It was banned by some of the sultans who drank, got actually too drunk. And it's complicated when you ban these things. A lot of hypocrisy comes on the side. But the other thing is, Christians and Jews in the Ottoman Empire could drink. Because Ottomans realized that their religion doesn't ban it, they do what we don't care. In the modern era, though, there are these old modern states from Iran to Indonesia to you name it, different parts of the Muslim world. And not all, but in some of them, there's this ambition to make Islamic law the law of the land, to impose it on people who are not Muslims in the first place. And that is unprecedented. That's not even classical Islam. And that's one reason this is wrong. Plus, there are a lot of Muslims who are Muslim, but whose interpretation of Islam is different, who is taking things more lightly, who has more modern interpretations. That's why, the whole tourism issue should be just a wake-up call. Like, why are we doing this to tourists? But then it should be the beginning of a discussion, like, why are we imposing our values on people? Iran has tried that, right, for 40 years, the Iranian Republic of Iran. They think Islam requires headscarf. You can wear it if you want, but no, they want to impose it on all women. They think alcohol is banned, so they try to ban it in all society. Iran didn't end up with a good result. Today, people are burning the very headscarves that is imposed on them by the Iranian regime, and they want to be free in order to be able to make a choice about what they wear. And I think Indonesia is certainly not anywhere close to Iran. It's by many measures still a second country, besides Aceh, which is a certain part in which an understanding of the Sharia is implemented by law. And I don't want to degrade Indonesia. There are indeed some actually good Islamic interpretations of Indonesia that has come out. As your guest just said, Nahdlatul Ulama, the biggest Islamic organization in the country, a few years ago took a very progressive step in calling Muslims to stop using the word kafir, which means infidel, to non-Muslims. And they're all about promoting tolerance. And these are all good things. But this law is problematic, and I will see how it will be implemented. And I'm curious to see how the Islamic intellectuals of Indonesia, quite a few which are actually devoted to human rights and democracy, will criticize. It's still on the news.
It seems, Mustafa, from what you're saying, from what David said, from what Antje said as well, from what we're reading from Indonesia, that this is a sort of incongruous juxtaposition. There are people who hold one point of view, and a government, it seems all the political parties, holding a different point of view and imposing that on everybody else, including tourists. Can I just pause you there, Mustafa, and bring in Antje from Bielefeld in Germany, Professor of Sociology at Bielefeld University. Antje, I hope you can hear us. We can see you clearly. I'm sure we can hear you. I'm getting the green light to go ahead. We were discussing Bali and the situation that might happen there, given its importance as a tourist hub, given it had something like, I think it's 9,000 visitors each day this year. Something like 1.4 million tourists have been there between January and October alone this year. And that's without talking about the visit of the G20, which of course brought in a whole load more people to spend their money and spend time in Bali. Clearly, this is business that I'm sure if there's a threat to how you can live your life when you're on holiday, it may well deter some people from going there.
Well, it's of course a big concern for people visiting Indonesia, both tourists but also investors. They will most likely face intrusions into their private lives. But I think I'm mostly concerned for people who are not even allowed to marry. And here I'm referring to people living in same-sex relationships. So I think that the new criminal code is a huge affront against the LGBTIQ community in Indonesia that has been facing a lot of oppression before this new criminal code was introduced. In Jakarta, which is not necessarily a huge tourist place, but has seen, for example, a lot of raids by vigilantes in the last years by groups such as FPI, Front Pembela Islam. They were storming into amusement corners, brothels, saunas, beating up people there, but also dragging them out on the streets to kind of put chain on them. So this is a huge concern, and this has been raised by a lot of Indonesians, individuals, activists, human rights groups, student groups, who have pointed out that lesbian and gay communities, they will face probably another huge setback once this law is being enforced, and once people will report these kind of extra marital or premarital personal matters. According to the code, there's only a certain kind of people who can make those reports. It has to be relatives or people of kin, close relationships. Not anybody can make this allegation or such a police report, but still it offers all sorts of opportunity for misuse, for abuse, in order to bring more hardship onto LGBTQI people.
Antje Misbach, thank you very much, Dale. I'll get back to you very shortly. David, what Antje's saying there, I think, is raising, certainly in my mind, a parallel with the kind of thing that did happen in Nazi Germany, where neighbours, family members were actually denouncing people they knew or thought they knew, or people they just wanted to get a bit of revenge on, to the authorities. Could that be? Is this clearly an area for misuse in Indonesia?
There could be possible for misuse, and I mean, it's not at all the same thing as the massacres of 1965, but the massacres that cost up to 1 million lives were often neighbours against neighbour. Okay, I'm not saying that we're not talking about the same level of.
But the principle's fairly similar, isn't it?
Yeah, the principle of denouncing your neighbour. Now it is limited to family members, and it is to come into play in about 3 years' time. So the time perhaps to this could be just an ambit bid by Jokowi for the elections of 2024. When he can't run again, but he's trying to prepare the ground for a successor who will choose. So it could be, present these laws and then hopefully they will be withdrawn. That's a cynical view. But he is definitely trying to play, I think, a rather delicate game here. In a country which is, as you said, has this long reputation of, moderate Islam. It's, for example, a country in which polygamy is really quite a minority phenomena, and is really frowned upon. It's a country where women, perhaps amongst all Muslim countries, have stronger rights than elsewhere. And so these also are concerned also for women, for the LGBT community particularly, but also for women, who several years ago opposed, they were going to introduce anti-pornography laws. And these were very much opposed by the feminist movement because the laws were designed in such a way that women were treated as objects, so that if a woman was out alone, she could be accused of being involved in something pornographic, and those laws were withdrawn. We haven't seen that opposition it's perhaps too early to say how far this will go. The fact that it was supported by a majority in the parliament is rather disturbing. Sure, it's common in the parliament to have large coalitions and rather weak opposition. But for it to be majority supported and to be argued that it is a kind of compromise is rather dubious.
It's a strange thing to think, as you say, all the parties behind one particular issue. What's that about?
I think it's, it's partly a response to this growing conservatism. To use the G word, it's a response to globalization. That this kind of, we're not in the free love of the 70s, but this kind of, Western lifestyle, which thinks things are okay that for people to live together unmarried. It's partly sort of a nationalist reflex. It's partly, the Indonesia is now the presider of the G20 is amongst the big players, and therefore it's a kind of a cultural defence. There's a kind of parallel with this kind of attack on wokeism that we find in the United States amongst religious conservatives and amongst people on the right. It has a sort of same kind of cultural motivation being used for political ends.
David, thank you very much indeed. Let's bring in Mustafa Akyol, Senior Fellow on Islam and Modernity at the Cato Institute, joining us from Washington. Mustafa, thanks for being with us. This idea you were mentioning earlier about the importance of family, and I think it's something all people share, whatever religion they're in. But this idea that this law is getting family members to denounce family members, it's very sinister, isn't it?
Yeah, that part is especially quite disturbing. I mean, I see your point there. Now, one thing I want to let's not forget, Indonesia is by and large still a moderate country in many ways. And I think these laws has to some extent to cater to the conservative segment of society who wants to gain here, we're protecting family, our values, and so forth. I would think that, when it comes to tourists or Westerners or foreigners, probably even if there's a law, people will look the other way and life will probably continue. That's the case that you find in most Arab countries. Like there are alcohol bans, but they're not implemented in tourists. That's what I would think it is. But the idea is wrong. And I think the idea that these are our values and we can implement them, we can sustain them by using coercive powers of the state. That idea is wrong. And that idea is wrong when it is done on when it is done on other grounds. So I think we are growingly in every society living in a very diverse world. Some people are conservative, some people are atheists, some people are secular. How to bring this together without conflict and without coercion, that's a big question. And I think we should all honor the value of freedom and minimal coercion in legal matters. Let people live in the way they want, in the way they dress. That can be dress in this sense, or that can be, alcohol and such way of life in Indonesia. And let's campaign for the freedom for them all. And I think in Islam there are grounds for making this argument. There's an oft-quoted verse of the Quran, which a lot of liberal-minded Muslims often quote, including myself, which says there is no compulsion in religion. I think that should be understood as there is no compulsion in religion, in entering religion or exiting religion or in practicing it, or there is no compulsion in religious morality as well. But of course, a lot of people don't understand it that way. And in fact, illiberal or authoritarian Muslim authorities sometimes tailor that verse. Instead of there is no compulsion in religion, they add a small word. It says there is no compulsion in entering the religion. They do that in Malaysia. And some people in Indonesia may be doing that as well. But these are issues that are going on in the world of Islam. And I think despite all the rights and wrongs, a more liberal of understanding of Islam will emerge over time because people see the counterproductive wrong effects of coercion, which is becoming very apparent, for example, in Iran these days.
Mustafa, thank you for now very much indeed. You mentioned Iran, of course, and there are ongoing demonstrations there after the death on September the 16th of Mahsa Amini, the 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman who was arrested because of her headscarf, arrested by the morality police. Mustafa earlier mentioning the fact that this is kind of echoing a morality police situation. Let's bring in Antje Misbach from Bielefeld, who's a professor of sociology at Bielefeld University. Antje, thank you for being with us. I hope you've been able to follow the debate as it's going. The sound's been quite challenging at times, I think, and I hope we've managed to try and sort that out technically. Antje, so I'll give you free rein now to talk about the issues. You mentioned earlier about the likelihood of LGBT people being basically very vulnerable in the wake of this law, open to being targeted, that kind of thing. With a growing sense of religious conservatism, to put it mildly, of Sharia law, for instance, in Aceh, which you've all mentioned, all three of you here in this debate. Is there a sense that this is going to grow, do you think, and become something that is more part and parcel of Indonesian society, something that will actually start little by little to replace the more modern, the more moderate aspects that people have grown to like and love about Indonesia?
Well, that's a very, very good question. What is going to happen? Because I think my two co-speakers might agree that it's all about how this law will eventually be enforced, who will go and report it to the police. And the judicial system in Indonesia is known for its inequality. Not everybody is the same in front of before the law. There seems to be quite some imbalance between those people who can avoid prosecution because they can pay their way out, they can grease the wheel in order to having to go to trial, and those people who cannot do that. Because David has brought up the example of Aceh, where Sharia law has been implemented a number of years ago. And even there we see cases where people can avoid, for example, public caning if they are able to pay a fine. And for the rest of Indonesia, I'm just now much more worried that people who are coming from societal strata with very little income, with very little social prestige, they can probably not buy their way out. It's probably an open secret that the Indonesian police is not particularly well-trusted institution. Surveys show again and again that there is not much trust in the police, in the authorities when it comes to doing their job. We've seen this particularly, for example, with the recent stampede in a soccer stadium in eastern Indonesia. So I think, again, it opens up a lot of doors for misuse and also for corruption, to put it bluntly.
Antje, thank you. David Cameron, can I bring you in on that one? Antje, talking about that football stadium disaster, which I think is the worst in world history. The number of people dying was over 130. Laying bare in many ways the elements of corruption that Antje was talking about that basically dog many societies, but also clearly Indonesia.
The most popular institution in Indonesia is the Anti-Corruption Commission, because it's considered to be dealing with, the fundamental illness of Indonesia, which is rampant corruption, as just been said. And she just said, you can buy your way out of anything if you've got the money to be able to do so. So this will exacerbate, the inequalities. At the same time, there is this sort of growing conservatism. When I first went to Indonesia, I hate to say it, in 1972, very few women wore the tudung, at least in the cities. In the countryside, it was a different thing. Today, it's also an affirmation of identity. So, and that's part of this reaction against westernization. At the same time, Indonesia is a sort of schizophrenic place because, for example, they have a fantastic girls' band or a series of girls' bands, which are, really sort of very much K-pop style. And at the same time, we've got this sort of conservative reactions.
How does that happen? This strange dichotomy you've identified.
Well, sort of underneath it, I guess, is particularly in Java, is this kind of, Hinduist kind of influence, animist kind of influence view of tolerance. I remember once speaking to the former president, Dr. Rahman Wahid, and he said to me, David, we cannot make Indonesia a Muslim country because that would be unfair to the minorities in the country. Things have somewhat changed, because of the influence of sort of an Islam coming from the Middle East. Fortunately, not as profound as in Malaysia. In the least recent elections in Malaysia, the Islamic Party saw its number of seats triple. And especially with votes from young people being brought up in Islamic schools. So far in Indonesia, we're not there yet. So these sort of attempts could be seen also as a way of kind of short-circuiting, so to speak, the more sort of stronger Islamic assertions. It's a rather dangerous game to play, however.
And the thing is about that, putting something on paper, on the statute book, changing it and making it a law changes the whole game completely, doesn't it?
Yes, it does indeed. Despite the provisions that it's only meant to be members of the family who can do that on the criticising the president, it's only the president who actually can bring out somebody to court on that issue. So the devil is in the details, but the details, as we know in the Indonesian judicial system, are prone to abuse.
David, thank you. Mustafa, back to you in Washington. You can't criticise the president. One thinks of liberal democracies where presidents are figures of fun and comedians will poke fun at them. One imagines that in Indonesia this kind of thing will not happen from now on.
Well, the law will say not criticism, but insulting the president will be banned. That's what they will say, of course. But there's a very fine line, and I know this very well from being Turkey originally, my home country. Turkey is probably the world record breaker in terms of putting people on trial for insulting the president. Our President Erdogan, who doesn't like his critics very much, his lawyers have sued more than 100,000 people in Turkey over the past 7-8 years, and not all of them go to jail, but some did, and others get the idea. I mean, Indonesia, I doubt Indonesia will go that far. I mean, I should say this. I mean, there is this idea that the head of the state should be a respected figure, even in some European societies as well. But if you begin to legislate this by making insult a crime, where does insult begin and when criticism ends? If you call a person a stupid dictator, for example, is that an insult or a criticism? Not that I would call Indonesia's president that way, but whatever people say. So these are very gray areas, and we see this in European legislation as well. I'm in favor of generally not having these laws so people can say whatever they say, and especially people in power should be more open to criticism precisely because they are in power, or insult as well, if that's the case. So that's another concern. And as I checked the actual list, it's not just the president, but governing ministries, the state ideology. So there are a lot of vague areas. So in that sense, this law it has concerning aspects regarding not just ethics or morality or morality policing, but also freedom of speech. If you begin to criminalize these things with the law, you don't know what court will implement, how courts will implement those things. They can say, oh, this criticism actually looked like insult, and that can change in a few years. So that's why it's important to get rid of these laws everywhere in the world. And it is certainly concerning that now Indonesia is taking the step to bring these new penalties.
Indeed, you make a very interesting point that a president should be able to take criticism. It kind of brings to mind the quotation from Beaumarchais, there can be no praise if no one is allowed to criticise. That's me paraphrasing Beaumarchais very badly. David's forgiving me because he's a very tolerant man. Antje, can I bring you back in from Bielefeld in Germany, professor of sociology? This idea that you can't insult the president, I mean, clearly this is starting to feel very, some might say, totalitarian.
Well, I mean, we probably have to look at where this criminal code is coming from and what purpose the revision was supposed to serve. Now, when Indonesia became independent in 1945, they did not take the time to draft a criminal code back then. But what they did was to just adapt the law that had been created by the Dutch colonizers before. And ever since, and this criminal code back then, of course, had a case or course about insulting the Governor General back then. That would have been deemed to be a major crime. Now, ever since, there were attempts to revise the criminal code in Indonesia, but I must say, for the first couple of decades, nothing fundamentally actually happened. There were a few passages, a few wordings. So they, for example, changed Governor General with government in general. So this has been in the making for many years, in fact, decades. And revising a criminal code is a lot of work. So it started when Jokowi, the current president, came into power. He made the revision of the criminal code one of his major tasks, and that's probably also why he's now so eager to have had it pushed through. But now that it has been voted in favor by the parliament, I think it's going to be very difficult to make any additional changes. I think this criminal code is going to stick around for a number of years, and even though, as David pointed out before, there had been a round of protests 2 years ago when it was originally supposed to be passed, and even though there were some consultations with members of the civil society, many passages, provisions have not been properly addressed. And since we've been focusing so much on morality today, there's another clause which is highly problematic that deals with indecency. It's problematic also because there are other laws in place. For example, the law against pornography, the law about electronic transmissions, which is very often used against critics in Indonesia already, and also a very recent law about violence against women. And they also deal with, for example, the matter of indecency, but they have somehow different definitions, and more importantly, they have different penalties for it. So now that indecency is once again taken up as a passage or as a paragraph in the criminal code, we see an additional mess in terms of what punishments will be handed down to the people who have been incriminated for indecency.
Antje Misbach, thank you very much indeed. So Indonesia, a moderate place, we're hearing one side, where these laws are being imposed, which will basically outlaw sex-aside marriage. That includes people visiting the country, which of course opens a whole different set of problems, of course, to how you enforce that law. David, you were suggesting earlier that the President Widodo might be trying to, in some way, get involved in some sort of Machiavellian scheme to lay the way for his successor coming up. That is quite a gamble with his country's image, with his country's standing, to sort of do something like that.
Indeed, it is, especially after the success of the G20, when Indonesia was on the map. I mean, this was the first the chairmanship of Indonesia, and it's also Indonesia had the freest press in Southeast Asia. And journalists are very concerned in Indonesia about these laws because the ambiguity about insulting and criticism is something to be used against journalists with the cyber laws that are in place, which are having an impact also on free speech and on the work of journalists. And this was one of Indonesia's great strengths. This is why it became attractive to foreign investors, not just to tourists, because of this. Freer environment that Western investors could understand. So it's a rather, to have that threatened because of this sort of political manoeuvring is indeed a dangerous game from my point of view.
But this political unity on the whole thing, all the parties across the board agreeing on it, it seems strange.
Well, consensus, the notion of guided democracy in Indonesia going back to President Suharto, there is this idea that consensus is a good thing in its own right. So the fact that he's achieved that is considered to be a good thing.
We will see how it goes. David, thank you very much to David Cameron from Sciences Po. Thank you for joining us. Thanks to Antje Misbach from Bielefeld University. And thanks to Mustafa Akyol joining us from the Cato Institute, where he's a fellow on Islam and modernity. Thanks to you for watching. Stay with us, more to come here on France 24.